Lesson 2.4. In this lesson, we have two different objectives that aren't really related, but we've crammed them into one lesson because they're both really short. The first objective is to be able to use the multiplication principle to determine the number of outcomes of multiple processes. The second objective is to determine the probability of an event not occurring. First, the multiplication principle. Suppose there are m possible outcomes for one process and n possible outcomes for a second process. The total number of possible outcomes for the two processes combined is m times n. For example, if you roll one die, you have 6 possible outcomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. If you roll a second die, the possible outcomes for that second die is also 6. And so the total possible outcomes for the two dice together is 6 times 6, or 36. Then if you added a third die in there, you'd have a total number of possible outcomes of 6 times 6 times 6, or 216 possible outcomes for rolling 3 dice. And as the number of dice increases, the number of possible outcomes is going to increase exponentially. All right, the second principle that we're talking about today is the probability of an event not occurring. If the probability of an event A is P of A, we write the probability that event A does not occur as P of not A. Because an event either does or does not occur, the sum of these probabilities is P of A plus P of not A equals 1. Therefore, the probability that event A does not occur is P of not A equals 1 minus P of A. In other words, the probability that something doesn't occur is equal to 1 minus the probability that that event does occur. And the reason for this is that something is either going to happen or it's not going to happen. We know that for certain. And remember, we said that the probability of an event that is certain is 1. And since we know for certain that an event is either going to happen or not happen, then the sum of the probability that it's going to happen plus the probability that it's not going to happen is 1. And so the probability that an event is not going to happen is equal to 1 minus the probability that it does happen. So now let's look at a couple of examples. All right, example number 1 says that we have 5 different shirts and 3 different pairs of pants and 4 different pairs of shoes, and we want to know how many different outfits can we make from these. And so this is an example of the multiplication principle, which is going to help us to be able to determine how many outcomes we have for a given situation. So notice that for each one of these shirts, we can pair it up with each of these 3 pairs of pants. So we could pair this one up with this, or this, or this, or we could take this shirt and pair it with the blue pants, or the red pants, or the black pants. Do the same thing with this shirt, or with this shirt, and with this shirt. And we could count all of those things up, but notice that for each pair of pants, there's 5 different shirts that we're going to wear, that we could wear with each of those pairs of pants. So all we're going to do is just multiply 5 times 3. So there's 15 different ways that we can, 15 different outfits, 15 different ways that we can pair a shirt with these pants. And then for each of those 15 different outfits, we can choose a different pair of shoes. And so what the multiplication principle says is that all we have to do to determine how many outfits we have here is just to take this number here times this number here times this number here. So we have 5 times 3 times 4, which is 60. And that's going to be our answer for example number 1. All right, example number 2 asks us to find the probability of not getting a 7 when we roll 2 6-sided dice. So the trick here is to recognize that we are either going to get a 7 or we're not going to get a 7. So those two probabilities have to add up to 100%, or a probability of 1. Remember, we said that a probability of 1 meant that an event was certain to happen. And we know that it is certain that either we're going to get a 7 or we're not going to get a 7. So the way to determine the probability of not getting a 7 is to determine the probability of getting a 7 and subtract that from 1. So we said earlier in earlier lessons that the probability of getting a 7 was 6 out of 36, because there are 6 different ways that event can happen. 6 different ways that we can get a 7. A 6 and a 1, or a 5 and a 2, or a 3 and a 4, or a 2 and a 5, or a 4 and a 3, or a 1 and a 6. There's 6 different ways that we can get a 7, and there's 36 total possible outcomes when we roll 2 dice. And 6 divided by 36, of course, is 1/6. That's the same as 1/6, which is approximately equal to 0.167. All right, so to determine the probability of not getting a 7, we're just going to subtract this from 1. So either take 1 minus 1/6, which is equal to 5/6, or we could do 1 minus 0.167, which is going to give us 0.833. And if we divide 5 by 6, we should get 0.833 as well. So that's the probability of not getting a 7 when we roll 2 dice.